Hi everybody, my name's Chloe and I'm Froglife's Development and Learning Officer for the Green Pathways project in Sussex. And today I'd like to talk to you about how important ponds are for amphibians and other wildlife and how you can help. I'm going to talk a little bit about who Froglife are as a charity and our vision. And then I'm going to talk about how you can make wildlife ponds, mini ponds, bog gardens and other features. And then I'm going to go into a little bit about the amphibian life cycle and focus on the common frog. And then we're going to talk a little bit about food chains and the food chains in a healthy pond. Okay, so who are Froglife? We're a national wildlife conservation charity, and we're concerned with the conservation of the UK's amphibians and reptiles and their habitats. Our experienced staff deliver conservation and education projects across the UK. And our holistic approach to nature conservation means we can take people on a wildlife journey whilst delivering amazing results for amphibians and reptiles. So Froglife's vision. Our vision is a world in which amphibian and reptile populations are flourishing as part of healthy ecosystems. Healthy ecosystems consist of native plant and animal populations interacting in balance with each other in a sustainable way. These ecosystems can be disrupted by a number of factors, including land use change, pollution, and invasive species. To turn Froglife's vision into a reality, we need your help. In the next few slides, I'm going to talk to you about how you could add water to your outdoor space, whether that's a garden, school space, or even a patio, and how boosting the number of ponds in an area to create a network is really beneficial for wildlife. So what can you do? It's easier than you think. On the Froglife website, we've got a downloadable resource called Just Add Water, and it goes into loads of detail about how to build your wildlife ponds. It's packed with information. You'll learn how to create your pond, the equipment that you'll need, how to look after it and how to maintain it throughout the seasons, and how to enhance it so it supports a huge range of wildlife. So why is adding water so important? 1/3 of ponds are thought to have disappeared in the last 50 years. So by adding water to your space, you can help us to reverse the negative impact of pond decline. Ponds are really important for frog, toad and newt life cycles. Without a pond, they wouldn't be able to lay their spawn and there would be nowhere for the tadpoles to turn into froglets and to eventually go onto land. Ponds help to boost local invertebrate populations, and invertebrates feed a wealth of wildlife, from hedgehogs and birds to our amphibians and our reptiles. Water, ponds, outdoor space is really good for our well-being. Spending time in green space has been shown to improve mental and in turn physical health, and ponds are fantastic places to watch wildlife. They're also a really vital water source for mammals and birds, especially things like hedgehogs in the summer. But make sure that you build a little ramp so that your hedgehogs can get back out of your ponds as well. That's important. Okay, I'm going to talk now a little bit about making a wildlife pond. So the ideal size for a wildlife pond in a garden, maybe 1 to 2 meters in diameter. If you can make it bigger, that's great, but 1 to 2 meters is absolutely fine. There are a few things you should consider when deciding to install your pond. Location is important. In early spring especially, your pond will need a lot of sunlight. This is because frogs prefer warm, shallow water to lay their spawn. Variety is really important. So that non-uniform shape that we've got on the picture on the left, that kidney bean shape, encourages lots of different habitats, as do the different depths, which you can see on the picture where it looks like it's got lots of little shelves. So those shallow shelved areas can be the most diverse areas in a pond. They're fantastic for tadpoles. So there's lots of different things which are good practice for creating your pond. So ensure the edges of your pond are level and remove sharp stones before laying your liner. The last thing you want to do is tear your liner with a sharp stone and then have your pond not retaining its water. If you dig a small trench for the liner edges, as you can see in the picture where the stones are kind of round it, if you weigh them down with rocks, that will keep the liner in place and stop it slumping down when you fill it with water. When you fill your pond, fill it with collected rainwater or tap water that you've treated to remove the chemicals. That's quite an important thing. If you treat your water, there won't be kind of excess nutrients in it and your colonising animals will be very happy. Select native plants that naturally filter the water. You don't necessarily need a pond filtration system. They're quite good for fish ponds, but not as good for wildlife ponds, as they tend to suck things in that you don't want. So there's lots of native plants that will naturally clean your pond. Those native plants also provide refuge for a variety of creatures at different depths. So we were talking about the tadpoles being very happy at the edges on those shelves. It's also important to wait for animals to colonise. They will arrive quicker than you think. So the native plants you could choose, there's a huge variety of them, and that will depend on your space and on your local area. But you could choose plants such as purple loosestrife, water mint, water forget-me-not. It's good to stick to local and good to stick to native plants as well. So tadpoles and adult frogs, they like places to hide. So if you design the planting in your pond so that there's an area of tightly arranged plants, this means there's lots of little places for them to hide themselves away. Amphibians will readily colonise a new pond if it's got suitable habitat and if they're able to reach it. So take a look around your space and make sure that they can get in from adjacent areas. It's very important. So if you've got solid fencing, those frogs might actually not be able to move in and colonise your pond. Equally, if you have moved frogs into your garden, then they might be very happy in your pond, but the rest of the habitat around your garden might not be ideal for them, and they may need to move further than your garden to find everything that they need for their whole yearly life cycle. Transferring animals from other ponds might accidentally introduce disease into your pond, so generally it's better to wait. If you don't have the space for a kind of in-ground pond, or for example, if you're in a rented property, like I am, you can make an above-ground pond. You can make a mini pond or a tub pond, and they can be really beneficial too. Just because you can't dig it into the ground, it doesn't mean it's not good for wildlife. So you can use an old sink, you can use a plastic tub, you could use an old bath. Make sure that, as you can see in the picture on the right, you build a sloping side with pebbles or logs, then amphibians can still get in and out. And choose some native plants so that there's lots of places for them to hide and forage as well. They may not breed in these ponds, but they will spend time in them, making sure that their skin is nice and moist in the summer when it's hot. And you'll also be encouraging invertebrate populations into your garden, which is generally fantastic for wildlife. You could also potentially make a bog garden. So a bog garden is a marshy, wet area used by amphibians to stay cool in the summer and to avoid drying out. So the ideal way to make a bog garden is to dig a 30-centimetre hole and lay some liner and then pierce it a little so the water can drain. So this is in contrast to our pond where we don't want holes in our liner. It's good to make a couple of holes in the liner in a bog garden because we're not creating a pond. What we're doing is creating a marshy area. So we do want the water to drain a little bit. To make sure your bog garden stays wet in the summer months, water it regularly with rainwater. That's really important. They're a really great idea to enhance a garden where pond building isn't practical. You can create them close to ponds as well to enhance the surrounding habitat. Don't think that if you have a pond, you don't need a bog garden. It'd be great to have both if you've got the space. And you can also think about adding other features into your garden. So you could think about the terrestrial habitats that amphibians might need. So building log piles or rockeries for reptiles to bask on. Compost heaps, they're great for amphibians, mammals. Really, really good to have a variety of habitats within your garden. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about amphibians and their life cycles. So in the UK, the amphibians you're most likely to find in and around your ponds are common frogs, newts, and common toads. Ponds are vital for their life cycles, and without bodies of water to breed in, they'll not successfully reproduce and their life cycles won't be complete. Although ponds are vital, they're only a small part of the amphibian life cycle. Ponds where breeding takes place, and this is where the spawn is laid and develops into larvae, so the tadpoles and the newtlets. Larvae then develop legs and they begin to transition into the next stage of life on land. This is where they need damp areas of habitat like bog gardens, log and leaf piles, so that their moist skin doesn't dry out on warm summer days. So a little bit more into the life cycle of the common frog. So garden ponds, very important for common frogs, especially in urban areas. Networks of ponds in urban areas are an absolute lifeline for common frogs. So adults emerge from overwintering sites in the spring and they immediately go to ponds to breed. The spawn is laid anytime from January onwards, and this varies from the south to the north of the UK. So spawn can be seen generally in the southwest in January, depending on the weather, and then it can take weeks and weeks for spawn to be seen up through the Midlands and then into Scotland. It's quite a different timing, which is really quite interesting actually. So after 2 to 4 weeks of the spawn being laid, the tadpoles will hatch and they'll feed on algae and things like water fleas. At around 16 weeks, they'll begin transforming into froglets. So they'll grow back legs and then they'll grow front legs, and then finally they'll absorb their tails. As you can see from the middle picture and then the picture on the right, it's got a little tail left over and then it finally disappears and it moves onto land. So froglets and adult frogs will be seen around ponds and in damp areas of habitat throughout the summer. In autumn, they'll prepare for winter. They'll be feeding on a variety of invertebrates, and then they'll find somewhere to overwinter. So this could be under rocks, in log piles, in your compost heap, or even at the bottom of ponds. So it's really important to have that diversity of habitat within your garden or your local area or your school grounds, anything like that. Really, really important to think about diversity when you are creating habitats. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the food chain in a healthy pond. So a food chain shows how energy flows through a system. And in this case, our system is a freshwater pond ecosystem. Organisms can be classed as producers, consumers, or decomposers based on their feeding habits. And I'll go into the definitions of those in a second. There's many interactions within a pond. It's really quite complex. It's less of a chain and more of a web. And if one of these interactions is altered, then the whole food chain can potentially be affected. For example, I said earlier that it would be really good to have ponds in quite a sunny area. It's best not to put a pond directly under a large tree, for example, because if trees overshadow your pond, fallen leaves can accumulate in autumn in the water. These decompose and they produce an excess of nutrients in the water. This excess of nutrients can increase algae growth. Algae is good in your pond in small quantities, not in big algal blooms. This algae growth decreases the levels of oxygen in the water, and this negatively impacts on the other wildlife that live in the water column. So I'm going to go into the definitions of our producers, etc., and talk to you about how the food chain in the pond works. So the plants are our producers. So we've got floating and rooting aquatic plants and algae as well. So these convert sunlight, water, oxygen and soil nutrients into living plant tissue. So essentially the plants grow and your ponds are fantastic and green and covered in beautiful plants. And these are there for the primary consumers, so our first level of herbivores, to eat. In turn, these primary producers are eaten by our secondary and tertiary consumers. So we've got our tadpoles and things that will feed on algae, and then they'll be potentially eaten by larger things. And you'll get things like pond skaters, diving beetles, and eventually you'll reach apex predators, which are things like birds and potentially hedgehogs and stuff like that. Very important in a pond, and we really can't forget them, is decomposers. So these are organisms like bacteria and fungi that break down detritus and dead organic matter to recycle the nutrients. These nutrients are then used by those producers, by the plants, to continue their growth and to keep the cycle going within the pond. It's very important that we've got those nutrients being removed by those plants so that we don't get an excess of nutrients within the pond. Okay, so that's a quick whistle-stop tour of Froglife's Just Add Water. We've talked about wildlife ponds, mini ponds, bog gardens. We talked about how networks of ponds are really, really useful. So frogs, amphibians, they can move up to 1 kilometre away from their breeding ponds. So having those networks is really, really key. So a little challenge for you, maybe if you're going out on a daily walk, is to try and spot how many ponds you can find in your local area and think about the habitat that connects them. Are they isolated ponds, Or can amphibians move freely between them? Are there big barriers like roads? Is the habitat fragmented, for example? We've chatted a little bit about native plants, but you can go on our website and look at links there to make sure that you're planting your ponds up with really fantastic plants that are good for wildlife. And we've also talked a little bit about those habitats that you can create on land, because our frogs don't just inhabit our ponds. It's really important to enhance our terrestrial habitat for them as well. So I'd like you guys to get creative and to start helping wildlife, even more than you do already. What we'd love for you guys to do, we've got a little photo challenge for you. So if you've taken a fantastic photo of an amphibian or a reptile this year, we'd love to see it. If you can go out into your garden at the moment and you're spotting amphibians when you're moving around, take a photo and post it on our social media. Have you got a fantastic example of a pond, log pile or compost heap? We'd really, really love to see them and be able to show all of the rest of our followers what people are doing and give great examples of how people can aspire to have just fantastic habitat for wildlife. So our social media, we're Froglife on Facebook, we are at Froglifers on Twitter and Instagram, and we'd like you to use the hashtag MNHFroglife, so that's Making Natural History Froglife. And it would be great to see as many of those as possible. So just again, my name is Chloe Dalgleish. I'm the Development and Learning Officer for a new project called Sussex Green Pathways. And we're looking to work with disadvantaged youth groups, getting them out, doing practical habitat management and things for wildlife and getting them in, working to engage with wildlife. If you guys have any questions, please post them now and I will do my best to answer them. Can't see any photos in the chat. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, they're fine. Oh, they're in the question tab, not in the chat. Oh, here we go. Right, okay. Yeah, so sometimes tadpoles do overwinter. Don't worry too much about that. They will do that, and then what they'll do is they'll delay until the next spring, and then they will develop as usual. So yeah, don't worry about that at all. I don't know why I can't see the ask a question bit. Sorry, guys. Oh, there we go. Sorry, found it. Could schools create wildlife areas, including ponds where possible? People within the communities who have some skills? Yeah, definitely. So it would be fantastic if lots more schools could create ponds. Obviously, they need to think about the management of those ponds. I've definitely been into a couple of schools where they've had a really, really engaged outdoor educator that's kind of developed their pond, and they've used it for a few years, and then sadly that member of staff has left, and that means that the pond gets kind of forgotten about, and the staff members that are left don't really know how to look after it. So I think it's fantastic when schools create wildlife areas, but they also almost need to create kind of groups of students that will potentially be responsible for the management of the pond, so that if that staff member leaves, they're not kind of stuck. Okay, so what percentage of a wildlife pond would you recommend to be shallow, and what's the minimum depth you'd have? So you basically want a gradient. So they can be, up to 60 centimetre depth, but you can have areas that are 30 centimetres, 20, 10. And if you've got that kind of staggered element to the edge of your pond, then it doesn't matter if there's a little bit of evaporation at the edges, because you've got another little bit that goes down. What you don't want is a tiny little bit there and then straight down. So you want a nice shelved area, so that if there is a bit of evaporation, there's still kind of shallow areas as well. So ponds covered in duckweed with lots of dead leaves. It's not optimum. So if you can potentially have a look on our website for how to manage your pond in winter, that's probably the best advice I can give you. There's lots of information in the Just Add Water download that you can look at, which will tell you how to kind of rejuvenate your pond a little bit in time for next spring. Okay, in spring, my pond is on the herons visiting list. What's the best way to keep my frogs safe? So, I mean, it's really good that you've got herons visiting. That's fantastic. I mean, we obviously want amphibians to be thriving, but we also want everything else to be thriving too. So what I would potentially do is make sure you've got that kind of close planting at the edges, so that things have places to hide. Equally, more kind of features lower down into your pond, so that there's places for them to tuck themselves underneath, so that the pointy heron's beak can't quite get in there. That's really all I can advise for that one. Should you clean your pond out on an annual basis? So that would depend on what your pond is looking like. So the previous question about it being full of leaves and algae, or duckweed, sorry. Again, I would say have a look on our website and look at the Just Add Water information, because it depends on the characteristics of your pond. It's best not to disturb it too much if you can help it, but that will depend on the levels of specific plants you've got in there, or whether it's not necessarily functioning as it should be. I've got a small plastic baby bath I'd like to recycle. Yes, that would definitely be suitable for a mini pond. Absolutely perfect. Anything that you think that can hold water, that you can, make into a mini pond, do it. You can even do it with an upturned bin lid. So, any increase in water provision for wildlife is fantastic. You can dig a hole for the baby bath and put it at ground level, or again, you could have it above ground. Just try and make some steps up to it so that amphibians and reptiles can get in and out. It's also important to build the steps on the inside of those mini ponds as well, because a lot of the time they'll have kind of straight plastic sides, and it won't be as easy for animals to get out of them again. Okay, I dug a pond recently to fill out over winter. The heavy rain carried a lot of mud into the pond, so the water's very mucky and cloudy. So potentially it will settle, yeah. So I would wait a little bit and see whether that settles. And also, yes, definitely think about your planting. That's really important. I'm going to again refer you to the website and the Just Add Water guide, because there's so much information in there. Can frogs and toads live together in the same garden pond? Yes, they can. Yeah, absolutely fine. They will both lay spawn at the same kind of year. They lay spawn in slightly different places and slightly different structures. So frog spawn is in clumps and toad spawn is in strings. So you'll be able to notice in the spring what you've got in your ponds. Again, also newts will live in there as well. There tends to be a little bit of a fluctuation with newt and other amphibian populations, but that's totally natural, and that's basically how the ponds work. How can we best support slow worms and newts in our gardens? So those damp areas and the places for them to hide, really important, and boosting invertebrate numbers. So anything that you can do to boost invertebrates, building log piles, building think about hibernacular and stuff for slow worms. So you might want areas of if you've got old bricks and things, you could create a habitat like that. Look on our website for how to create stuff for reptiles as well. We've got lots and lots of information about both amphibians and reptiles. Thank you so much for fantastic questions. I'm sorry it took me a minute to find them. If anybody has any other questions, they can email me, chloe.dalgleish@froglife.org, or they can ask on our social media as well. And everybody on there would be more than happy to answer questions. And we would really love to see all of your photos. I especially want to see a photo of that baby bath once it's into the allotment. Ooh, which amphibians are best at eating slugs? I don't know, actually, I'm afraid. Lots of them do like eating slugs, as do things like hedgehogs. So if you want fewer slugs in your garden, then think about the animals that eat them and how you can create habitat and access for them to get in, so that they can act as natural pest control. Okay, fab. I think that is the end of the question. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming along and listening to my talk. Yeah, it's been fab. Thank you so much.